This story begins as an appointment. That is the first lie. Because appointments are supposed to lead somewhere. A name, a time, a place, a door that opens, a person waiting on the other side. But on a January night in Liverpool in 1931, an insurance agent named William Herbert Wallace was sent across the city to meet a man he had never heard of, at an address that was not there. The man was called R.M. Qualtrough. The address was 25 Menlove Gardens East, and the problem was simple. There was no Menlove Gardens East. There was a north. There was a south. There was a west. But east did not exist. So Wallace walked. He asked strangers. He asked a policeman. He knocked at the closest thing he could find. No Qualtrough. No appointment. No client. Only a false address sitting in his notebook, like a joke that had not yet revealed its punchline. And while Wallace was searching for a street that did not exist, back at his home on Wolverton Street, his wife Julia was dying, or had already died. That is one of the things this file still refuses to answer, because the fake address is not just a clue, it is the whole machine. If William Wallace created it, then he built one of the coldest alibis in British criminal history. If someone else created it, then an innocent man was lured away from his house while his wife was murdered and almost hanged for it. This is the case of William Herbert Wallace, a husband, a chess player, an insurance agent, a condemned man, and, officially, an acquitted man, but not an exonerated one. Because sometimes, a court can remove a noose from a man's neck and still leave the question wrapped around his name. This is false fiction, and tonight's file begins with a phone call. Before the fake address, before the trial, before the word Qualtrough became one of the strangest names in British murder history, William Herbert Wallace looked like the kind of man a mystery novel would ignore. He was not glamorous, he was not violent, he was not theatrical. He was a middle-aged insurance agent for the Prudential Assurance Company, living in Anfield, Liverpool, with his wife Julia. Their house was at 29 Wolverton Street, a modest terrace in a working, ordinary part of the city. William had poor health. He had a reserved manner. He was interested in chess, chemistry, music, and reading. He played the violin. Julia was musical too. From the outside, theirs was not the sort of marriage people expected to become evidence. And that is what makes this file so difficult. Because most murder stories try to teach you the motive first. Money, jealousy, revenge, a secret lover, a debt, a confession waiting to happen. But in the Wallace case, motive is a fog. Every theory reaches into it and comes back with something possible, but not enough. William and Julia had been married for years. Their life seemed small, careful, routine. He collected insurance payments. She kept the home. They had no children. They were not wealthy. They were not socially dramatic. And then, on Monday the 19th of January, 1931, William went to his chess club at the City Café in Liverpool. That detail matters. Because this case is not only about a murder, it is about timing. It is about distance. It is about trams, phone boxes, street names, witnessed movements, and whether a man could be in two places close enough to guilt and far enough from proof. At the cafe, before Wallace arrived, a phone call came in. The caller asked for Wallace. He was not there yet. So the message was taken down and later given to him. A man named R.M. Qualtrough wanted to see him the following evening, Tuesday, at 7:30 p.m., at 25 Menlove Gardens East, about an insurance matter. It sounded plausible enough. Wallace was an insurance agent. Appointments were part of his work. A stranger wanting a policy was not strange. But if you were watching the file from above, you would see the first red flag immediately. The address was wrong. Not misspelled, not hard to find, non-existent. And the person who gave it knew that the message would do one of two things. Either Wallace would ignore it, or Wallace would go looking. And Wallace went looking. There are 3 lies in this story. Lie 1, the appointment was real. Lie 2, the fake address proved Wallace was innocent. Lie 3, the fake address proved Wallace was guilty. The truth lives in the space between those last 2 lies, because the same fact can point in opposite directions depending on who you think placed it there. If Wallace invented Qualtro, then the call was a masterpiece of pre-planning. He could send himself to the wrong part of Liverpool, create a trail of witnesses, ask questions in public, return home, and perform the discovery of his wife's body. But if someone else invented Qualtro, then Wallace was not staging innocence. He was being moved like a chess piece. And the person moving him understood his habits, his work, and his willingness to honor a professional appointment. That is what makes this case so maddening. The fake address is not evidence in one direction. It is evidence, shaped like a mirror. On Tuesday, the 20th of January, William Wallace went about his normal rounds. Later, this would matter because the prosecution needed him to become 2 different men. The first was the calm insurance agent seen by clients during the day. The second was the calculating killer who, according to the state's theory, would soon murder his wife, clean himself, leave almost no trace, and calmly ride across Liverpool chasing an imaginary client. That evening, Wallace said he left his home at around 6:45 p.m. to keep the appointment with Qualtro. He travelled by tram toward Menlove Gardens. If you are telling this like fiction, this is where the audience expects suspense music. The husband is away, the wife is alone, the address is fake, the stage is set. But real cases do not behave as cleanly as stories. Wallace did not vanish into some hidden alley. He made himself visible. He asked people where Menlove Gardens East was. He asked a tram conductor. He asked residents. He asked a policeman. He went to 25 Menlove Gardens West, the closest match, and found no Qualtro there. Each question was either innocent confusion or deliberate theatre. That is the problem. Every movement becomes both an alibi and an accusation. If he is innocent, he is behaving exactly like a man who has been sent on a fool's errand. If he is guilty, he is behaving exactly like a man who wants witnesses to remember him asking for a place that cannot be found. After searching for roughly 40 to 45 minutes, Wallace gave up. There was no East, no client, no Qualtro, so he went home. And home, by then, was no longer home. It was a crime scene waiting for its first witness. When Wallace returned to Wolverton Street, he said he could not get into the house. The front door would not open. He went around the back. That would not open either. Then neighbours John and Florence Johnston appeared. They were going out for the evening and saw Wallace struggling. This is one of those moments that feels scripted because it is too useful. A husband returns to a dark house. He cannot get in. Neighbours arrive at exactly the right time to see his confusion. Then, suddenly, with them nearby, the back door opens. Wallace goes inside. A moment later, he calls them in. Julia Wallace is dead in the front sitting room. The room is violent, but the house is strangely controlled. There is no obvious forced entry. There is no murder weapon recovered. A Macintosh, identified as Wallace's, is found near or under Julia's body and has blood on it. A cash box appears to have been disturbed. Some money is missing. But other money in the house has not been taken. So the scene says robbery, then unsays it. It says domestic murder, then resists it. It says intruder, then leaves no clean path for one. This is why the Wallace case became famous. Not because there are no clues, because there are too many clues that cancel each other out. The fake address says someone wanted Wallace out of the house, or that Wallace wanted the world to believe someone wanted him out of the house. The missing money says robbery, but the money left behind says staging. The lack of blood on Wallace says innocence, but the Macintosh says preparation. The timing says impossible. Then someone says, maybe not impossible. That is the trap this file sets for anyone who opens it. Every answer unlocks another locked door. The police soon focused on William Herbert Wallace. It is not hard to understand why. The husband discovers the body. The house shows no clear forced entry. The call that lured him away was made from a phone box only a short distance from his home. The appointment suited his work. The address gave him a reason to be absent. From the prosecution's view, the fake address was not a trap, it was a prop. Their theory was that Wallace himself had arranged the call or caused it to be arranged. He had then killed Julia before leaving, traveled to the non-existent address, created his public trail, and returned to discover the scene he had made. It sounds clever. Maybe too clever. Because to accept that theory, you have to accept a man with no strong, proven history of violence, no obvious motive, weak health, and a quiet public life, suddenly designing an alibi around an invented man with an invented address. You also have to explain the blood. The murder was violent enough that the killer should have been marked by it. But Wallace's clothes reportedly showed no blood. No murder weapon was found. And there was the timing problem. A milk boy, Alan Close, placed Julia alive at a time that, if accurate, left Wallace with a brutally narrow window to commit the killing, clean up, leave, and catch his tram. If that evidence was right, the prosecution's case began to shrink around the clock. But trials are not only about what happened, they are about what a jury can imagine. And in April 1931, at Liverpool Assizes, a jury imagined William Wallace guilty. After roughly an hour of deliberation, Wallace was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The fake address had become a gallows. But the case was not finished, because suspicion can convict a man in a courtroom, but sometimes suspicion collapses when it is forced to stand next to proof. This is the redacted line in the file. Who was R.M. Qualtrough? Not who he said he was. That much is obvious. There was no insurance client waiting at Menlove Gardens East. There was no genuine appointment. There was no honest reason for Wallace to be sent there. Qualtrough was a voice with a purpose. But whose purpose? The name itself feels invented in a way that fiction would be embarrassed to attempt. Qualtrough. It is too odd, too memorable, too theatrical. And that may have been the point. A strange name sticks. A strange address sticks. The chess club remembers it. Wallace writes it down. The journey becomes traceable. If Wallace created the name, it was a signature disguised as a clue. If another person created it, it was bait. There have always been alternative suspects and theories. One of the names often raised is Richard Gordon Parry, a former colleague of Wallace's, someone who knew aspects of his work, and whose later reported alibis and behavior have drawn suspicion from some writers. But suspicion is not solution. The danger with old cases is that time turns possibility into confidence. A person becomes the answer because the story wants an answer. False fiction does not need the file to be solved for the file to be disturbing. The disturbing part is that the entire case may depend on a voice no one can now identify. A voice that called a cafe. A voice that used a fake name. A voice that gave a fake address. A voice that moved a husband away from his wife, or gave a husband the excuse to move himself. That is the locked room inside the case, not the parlor, the phone call. Wallace was sentenced to die, but in May 1931, the Court of Criminal Appeal did something extraordinary. It quashed his conviction. The court held, in substance, that the guilty verdict could not be supported having regard to the evidence. That phrase matters, because it did not mean the court had solved the case. It did not mean Wallace was proven innocent in the way a mystery ending proves innocence. It meant the evidence against him was not enough. It meant suspicion had overreached. It meant the law could not let a man hang because the story made him look wrong. And that is why R.V. Wallace became legally significant, not just culturally famous. It is often remembered as an important example of an appellate court stepping in where a conviction rested on suspicion and circumstantial interpretation rather than firm proof. Wallace walked out of court a free man. But freedom is not the same as restoration. He returned to a world that still had opinions. Some people believed he had escaped justice. Others believed he had been nearly killed by an incompetent investigation. Either way, he had lost Julia. He had stood under a death sentence, and the question of his guilt followed him into every room he entered afterward. He died in 1933, only 2 years after the appeal. Julia's murder remains officially unsolved, and R.M. Qualtrough remains one of crime history's most haunting inventions. There is a reason the Wallace case has lasted almost a century. It is not just because it is unsolved. Many cases are unsolved. It is because the Wallace case is built like a logic problem that refuses to resolve. William Wallace was a chess player, and the case behaves like a chess puzzle. Move one piece, and the board changes. If Wallace is guilty, the fake address is genius. If Wallace is innocent, the fake address is genius. If the killer was an outsider, he needed knowledge of Wallace's routine, enough nerve to enter the house, enough luck not to be seen, and enough control to leave behind a scene that would trap the husband. If the killer was Wallace, he needed a level of planning and composure that almost feels inhuman, plus a way to avoid the physical traces expected from the crime. Neither explanation is comfortable. That is why this story belongs in false fiction, because it sounds written. A mysterious call, a chess club, a fake client, a non-existent street, a husband wandering a strange neighborhood while his wife is killed at home, a death sentence, an appeal, an acquittal, no final answer. If a novelist invented it, readers might accuse them of cheating. But reality does not care about fair play. Reality does not have to plant clues that lead somewhere. Sometimes it leaves a fake address in the middle of a murder case and walks away. There are 2 impossible versions of this case, and both ask the audience to believe something difficult. Version 1. Wallace did it. In that version, he is not the dull insurance man people thought they knew. He is a planner. He is an actor. He is a man who uses his own dullness as camouflage. He invents Qualtrough. He arranges the message through the chess club because the chess club gives the lie witnesses. He chooses a district far enough away to consume time, but close enough to travel by tram. He chooses a fake address similar to real streets so that his search will look believable. Then he kills Julia, leaves without blood on his clothing, crosses the city, asks enough questions to make himself memorable, returns home, struggles theatrically with the doors, and discovers the body in front of neighbors. That is the prosecution version in its most elegant form. But elegance is not proof, because that version asks us to accept a lot. It asks us to accept that Wallace created a plan of exceptional nerve, but left pieces that looked clumsy. It asks us to accept that he handled the physical consequences of a violent killing with almost impossible cleanliness. It asks us to accept that the absence of direct evidence was not innocence, but skill. Version 2. Wallace was framed. In that version, someone else knew enough about him to weaponize his routine. Someone knew he was an insurance agent. Someone knew a new client message would draw him out. Someone knew the chess club would pass the message on. Someone knew how to give him a task that would waste time without immediately looking absurd. Then, while Wallace was away, that person entered the house, killed Julia, disturbed the money, and left without being reliably seen. That version also asks a lot. It asks us to believe in a killer with timing, access, nerve, and knowledge. It asks us to believe that the killer could create not only a murder, but a murder shaped to look like Wallace made it. And that is why the case has survived. Not because one theory is perfect, because both theories are damaged in exactly the right places. A guilty Wallace requires a genius performance from an ordinary man. An innocent Wallace requires an unseen offender who understood him too well. And somewhere between those two impossibilities, Julia Wallace disappears from the center of her own murder. So bring her back for a moment. Julia was not a riddle. She was not a chess piece. She was not simply the body that made the puzzle famous. She was a woman in her own sitting room, killed in her own home, and the argument over William has always risked turning her into a clue instead of a person. That is the cost of famous mysteries. The puzzle becomes immortal. The victim has to be deliberately remembered. For a direct-to-camera episode, this is where the temptation will be strongest to choose a side. Do not give in to it too early. This file works because the viewer should feel what the appeal court eventually recognized. Suspicion is powerful, but power is not proof. Let the audience lean one way, then turn the file. If they think Wallace obviously did it, remind them of the lack of blood, the timing problem, the missing weapon, and the fact that his conviction was quashed. If they think Wallace was obviously innocent, remind them that the false address is so useful to him that it is hard to ignore. It removed him from the house at the precise time he needed to be removed, and it allowed him to collect witnesses in a different part of Liverpool. The truth is not that the case has no answer. The truth is that every answer has to borrow from uncertainty. That makes this episode different from a standard murder mystery. There is no clean final reveal where a hidden villain steps out from behind the curtain. The reveal is colder than that. The reveal is that the criminal justice system once almost executed a man on a case that an appeal court later found could not stand. The reveal is that a fake address can become more persuasive than physical evidence. The reveal is that a lie does not have to tell us who created it to do damage. And that is the line this episode should leave behind. A fake address does not need to exist. It only needs someone to believe it long enough. So what do we know? We know Julia Wallace was murdered in her home on Wolverton Street on the 20th of January, 1931. We know the night before, a man using the name R.M. Qualtrough sent William Wallace to a fake address. We know Wallace searched for Menlove Gardens East and came home to find his wife dead. We know he was convicted and sentenced to death. We know the Court of Criminal Appeal quashed that conviction. We know no one else was ever convicted. And we know that the case still balances on one question. Was the fake address a husband's alibi or another killer's trap? That is the final redaction, and after nearly a century, it is still blacked out. False fiction, unscripted truth with no rules. File closed.